You are speaking to us from Haifa in 1948 Palestine. I'd love to hear your perspective on where things are overall. It seems pretty clear that despite talk from the White House, we're not going to get a ceasefire. And meanwhile, there is growing fear of a new front in this catastrophe opening up in Lebanon, with Israel threatening to launch a new war there. What's your assessment of where we're at?
That's exactly what Netanyahu wants. Is he definitely wants to open up a new front, and he wants to do it for a couple of reasons. One is that Israel has been defeated. This has been a huge loss for Israel in Gaza. And I say this knowing the full weight and the very heavy price that Palestinians have paid with 40,000 that we know of dead, the flattening of Gaza City, the untold, the year, it's going to take 17 years just to remove the rubble, much less 80 years to rebuild Gaza, the destruction of lives, of generations. And at the same time, if you look at it from the perspective of what Israel wanted, they said that they wanted three things. One was to return the Israeli captives. The second was to get rid of Hamas. And the third was to make sure that there could never be another October 7th again. And yet, what you see now, after 265 days, is that the only way that Israel has been able to secure the release of the captives is through a ceasefire, with the exception of the one quote unquote rescue operation, in which they killed close to 300 Palestinians. Second is that you can see that they haven't defeated Hamas. In fact, now their military is saying that Hamas is an idea that can't be defeated. And third, you can see that the resistance is still continuing when the Israelis are have gone into the north. You now see that, and after they claim that it's been quote unquote cleaned, you see that much of the resistance is now coming from the north of Gaza. That is. So for Netanyahu, he needs to open up another front, and that's why he's so keen on going after Lebanon. Plus, he needs to open up that front in order to maintain his power. He's made it clear that he's not going to push for a ceasefire. He doesn't care about the Israeli captives, and so all that he cares about is remaining in power. And so it's pretty clear to me that he's going to go ahead and attack Lebanon.
If he does that, do you think he would have U.S. support? Because it seems to me that Israel could not fight Hezbollah unless it had the backing of the U.S.
Well, it will probably get U.S. backing because it seems to always be getting U.S. backing. But I'm not so sure that I get the sense now that the United States recognizes that despite all of the weaponry, and it's been a lot, and despite all of the political support, despite the economic support, the diplomatic support in terms of crushing things, threatening the ICC, you name it, I think that the U.S. knows that Israel is not this great army that it thinks it is. And so the question is whether they're going to be the force that tells Israel to stop, or whether they're going to let Netanyahu go ahead. At this point in time, Aaron, it seems to me that it's the tail that's wagging the dog. We see that as much as Israel is an outpost, it's an extension of U.S. power, that it seems now that instead of it recognizing that it's an outpost, that it's the one that is calling the shots. The fact that we saw a ceasefire proposal come forward by the U.S. and that Israel never really endorsed it, even though the Biden administration said that it was accepted by Israel, is pretty telling to me. It shows to me that it's Israel that's leading and the U.S. that's following.
You referred to the fact that it's in Netanyahu's best political interest to keep this war going. Even Biden admitted that.
Yeah.
Can you explain why that is? What happens to Netanyahu when this does end?
So back when Netanyahu was last elected, which was the end of 2022, before that, there were, and there have been for quite a number of years, there have been charges and allegations of corruption against him. And one of the reasons that the courts have not continued, or at least the prosecution has not continued against Netanyahu, is because he's the sitting prime minister. And so his calculation is that once he's no longer the sitting prime minister, that they will come after him for these corruption allegations. And that's the irony of all of this, is that if he ever serves jail time, it will be over financial corruption, not for the fact that he's been at the head of a genocide and pushing for genocide. So he wants to remain in office as long as possible, because by remaining in office, I think he's hoping that either Israelis will say, "All right, enough," and we will pardon you for any of these corruption charges, or he thinks that perhaps people will somehow forget. Or a third case scenario, which is very unlikely, is that he's going to somehow be the person who leads them to victory, and therefore they will excuse all of his previous ills.
As someone who was a negotiator, can you tell people what it would look like if Netanyahu actually cared about freeing the hostages?
Oh, if he actually cared about them, then he would have done what should have been done very early on, which is negotiate a ceasefire, not bomb Gaza, and secure the release of them, as well as release the thousands of Palestinian hostages who are languishing in Israeli prisons. Instead, what he's done is the opposite. And this is why you can look at these ceasefire proposals with such skepticism. Instead, what he's done is he's bombed Gaza to virtual smithereens. He's not at all negotiated a ceasefire arrangement. He's ended up getting even more Palestinians and throwing more Palestinians in prison. There's upwards of 9,000, with just the other day reports coming out that there were 21,000 who were arrested during this 8.5-month period. And so instead of actually negotiating, he's made the situation worse. It's very likely that many of them are now dead in Gaza. But that's always been the case. He just doesn't care about them. And this is why he doesn't speak to the families. He's not listening to these protests. It's clear that all he's ever wanted to do is to commit genocide, to perpetrate a genocide. That's it. He doesn't want to do anything else. If he had wanted to, the offers were there from the first few days. And instead of going with those offers, he instead decided that he was going to try to flatten Gaza.
And is there any restraining force on him inside Israeli politics, whether it's the captives' families, the protesters that are out there blockading streets that, Western media makes a big deal of as a sign that Netanyahu faces domestic opposition? People inside his own government, like Yoav Gallant was just in the U.S., and there's talk of him splitting with Netanyahu sometimes. Does any of this constrain or curb Netanyahu's behavior?
No, not at all. It's interesting how it gets played up in the mainstream Western media of how much pressure he's under. But from the perspective that I see as somebody who lives here, yes, there are protests, and yes, you do see people blocking streets, and yes, you do see people having strikes. There's going to be another strike next week. But it doesn't seem to be tempering him in any way, shape, or form. Instead, what is driving him is, again, this idea that he'll somehow face prosecution, and the idea that his coalition may collapse. But there's also something very important, which is we shouldn't always just blame his coalition. This is something that he has wanted to do. His genocidal ideology predates anything that happened in October. It's always been with him. And so this is something that he fundamentally wants to do. The protest movement inside Israel is growing, but it doesn't seem to be having any effect whatsoever. If you end up seeing that some of the people who are released are coming out, as we've seen, saying that it's now time to negotiate with Hamas, and instead he blows them off, then it's clear that he just doesn't care about these people. He doesn't care about their families at all.